All right, everybody. I want to thank you guys for coming back. If you're online, now the speaker is our own state education officer for the Grand Lodge of the state of Illinois, Brother Scott Dueball. Brother Scott, for him, education has been a lifelong experience. Scott holds a bachelor's of science in exercise science, engineering, and math from Valparaiso University, and a master's of science in biomechanics back to schools for more. So his research has been published and presented in numerous outlets. He enjoys time with his wife and daughter, smoking meat and woodworking in his free time. Scott was the master of D.C. Cregier Lodge, number 81, twice. He was a district education officer. And he currently serves as our charter master for Space Novum Lodge, which meets upstairs. So he was our charter master and then the first year master. So he's exiting that seat. He, again, a state education officer for us, and he's the chairman of the Committee on Masonic Education under our Grand Lodge. And as such, I report to that guy. So, but without any further ado, please put your hands together for our state education officer, Scott Dueball. I don't know what. There you go.
All right. So I apologize. Just had an espresso. So this is probably going to be about a 15-minute presentation, and there will not be enough time to take notes. When we started talking about what I wanted to address today, RJ was really pushing me for a title, and I started to coalesce some thoughts of this title, and that was great. And quite honestly, I think the rest of the presentation isn't necessarily going to refer to this title, although I will address this in at least one segment. But the idea here is building a physical temple where a spiritual one would suffice. And the question that I will absolutely be addressing is, are you practicing Freemasonry or merely consuming it? And this is a heavy topic, at least the way that I intend to approach it. And we've kind of addressed this, that this may create conflict for some of you. So I've done my best. Billy Mays and I have done our best to bring some memes. So if you get tired of listening to me talk, or if you get pissed off at me, just focus on the memes for a little bit. And hopefully that will simmer some things down. But I used to think that Masonic education was everything, that it was the key to engaged members, and that was ultimately what mattered, that it would save lodges, that it would save Masonry. I even thought it was going to save a lodge that I was the master of. I was going to use this. This was going to be the solution. And then it really didn't. It didn't pan out. That lodge wasn't, I don't want to say it wasn't ready. I don't think that lodge was interested in doing Masonic education, and I was. And I think consequently, this is less important to me these days. I don't worry about saving Masonry or lodges. Masonry, true Masonry, certainly needs saving, but not in the way that you might think I mean that. We need to be doing Masonry. That's the part that needs to be saved, that there's this act of Masonry that we aren't doing. We're just hovering around it. Needs to be saved from turning into a social group, a Toastmasters club, or any number of other things that we want to transition it to because that will bring members in. But in reality, that's not what we are. Masonry is an act. It's a verb. And as such, Masonic education is not Masonry. I will repeat that. Masonic education is not Masonry. They're two separate things, and we're going to go and I'm going to pick this apart. And I'm not saying don't do Masonic education. I'm not saying it's not important. But if we aren't effectively communicating what the act of masonry is, then your so-called education is bullshit. So, when we talk about masonry, the next couple slides are going to address this, but masonry being, a system that makes good men better. I don't really believe that you can teach a man to be good. That's a decision that they look in the mirror every day, and they have to make that on their own. And over time, through a series of decisions that line up one after another, they become better men. But I don't believe that's something you teach them. That's internal. If you think about it, humans are unique in their ability to act altruistically, to be good. But I would say the instant you incentivize self-improvement, that process of becoming good is not really good, because you've attracted them to something else and you're tricking them into being good. Well, I wouldn't really consider that an improvement. And I would say that the function of ritual is what makes men better. That's the function of our fraternity, which makes men better. It's not the individual doing something. It's not necessarily the lodge, any more than the lodge putting on that particular rite and providing you access to our ritual. And in that regard, the rite, meaning, the night you went through the degree, that's the rite, separate from the ritual being, the words written down or not written down, past mouth to ear. But the rite is the vehicle for self-improvement. The ritual is only the guide. And I think one of the problems that we've created here is that we've commercialized Masonic education and thereby incentivized things other than, or excited people around things other than the specific thing that we should be, that act of masonry. We're exciting people about other things, but not the act, not living out masonry, not exploring masonry. And so consider this sports analogy. Football happens exclusively for 60 minutes, no more than once a week. Football requires pads. Now, you might enjoy watching it. You might enjoy watching 30 minutes of human interest pieces before the game. You might listen to the talking heads on the radio, expand your knowledge of the game, the players, who's coming up through the different divisions. You might enjoy reading books on the history of the game, visiting scores of stadiums, buying all the swag that demonstrates that you are, in fact, a football evangelist. You might even make fun of other lesser yet oddly similar sports, soccer, that have balls of different shapes. But the fact is that football is the act of players putting on a helmet and smashing into the opponent. And your affinity for any of those other things does not change the fact that those other things are not football. They are ancillary. They are not the main thing. They are not the game, right? And take that a step further. The game of football exists in other areas without that. It exists on the playground. It exists at Pee-wee, high school, and even some college without all those other ancillary things. That still is football, but the ancillary things are not. And in the same way, masonry is an act. It is not talking about tangential albeit interesting topics, including but not limited to the origins of Freemasonry, famous Masons, the landmarks of Masonry, regardless of whether you're talking about Mackeys or Pounds. It's not visiting every lodge for the sake of visiting every lodge. Sorry, Jeremy. It's not listening to every podcast or reading every book. It's not buying a bunch of shirts, pins, rings, memberships, books, anything else. It's none of those things. And as we talk about the commercialism, the way that we have created all these things that you can consume, what we've done is we've unintentionally built a hurdle for a lot of people. And now this is where I'm speaking from my experience in my role as a state education officer, and even before that as a district education officer. People would come up and say, how do I do this? What am I supposed to do? Where do I get started? And then eventually you get to this question that's like, okay, what books should I be buying? Can you make me a book list? I'm on Facebook. If you're a member of Esoteric Freemasonry, man, that group gives me heartburn on a weekly basis. But we'll get in there. I'm a brand new Master Mason. What are good books for me? And almost without fail, a series of awful recommendations get filled in. And I say awful recommendations. They're what's bad. The books themselves are not bad. But when you recommend them to a guy who doesn't understand it, he feels stupid. I'm going to put a finer point on this. A part of me dies every time I see this question get asked in any group on social media and someone throws in morals and dogma. Okay? And the reason is morals and dogma, the portions that I read, because I'm comfortable enough admitting that I've not read the whole thing, but I've probably read more of it than most people that pretend that they've read all of it.
Judge me.
It's a fantastic and it's an important book, but for a guy who just came through, it's not a great place to start. And there's a handful of books that I think are a great place to start, and those are usually the only titles I would farm out in these kind of questions. But I'm always, tepid in my response because I just don't know people well enough to know what's going to click with them. And what happens is some guy says, "Oh, great, I'm going to go buy Morals and Dogma." And then they start to Google that. And of course, most of you know what happens when you Google Morals and Dogma, the first couple of quotes that come up. That's great. But then they go and they take this and they struggle with it. And they're like, this isn't at all what I went through. And in some cases, it might not be. But they feel stupid and they say, forget it, I'm out. And what I really, really want to get across here is that each of you, all the men, all the people we are bringing into Masonry, you're all intelligent enough to gain a deeper understanding of Masonry. That element isn't needed of really trying to get into some of these deeper esoteric texts right out of the gate. And so while we're on the topic of kind of railing on some of this commercialization, because I promised at the beginning that I would address the title of my presentation, I need to just take one swath through some notes here. But I would say, I don't want to cheat you, so we're going to cover this. Buying stuff serves material needs of the ego, and that is fundamentally a distraction. And this is something, I'm going to take the heat off myself a little bit. Dago touched on this in the last presentation. Your titles, your pins, those things, they don't matter. And they don't force you into becoming, there's not a one-to-one correlation to you becoming a better man or Mason. And as a result, they're often a distraction. It's not entirely that simple, but I think that Masons need to come to grips with their materialism. I wrote an article a while back about this, and I got a lot of flack about saying that you don't need these things, these material things, they don't matter as much as what we say they do. And I would say that if this gets you bent out of shape, if me saying this makes you uncomfortable, I really want you to take some time, on your own, not now, but take some time and reflect on why that makes you uncomfortable. Because I think there's an opportunity to grow, for you to grow. Oh, sorry. I want to make sure I hit on Marie Kondo here. This is same kind of concept. This has been going on Facebook lately. And apparently I have my slides out of order. So back to the books thing. So we push books a lot on a lot of things, but nearly all of those books that we talk about, they address subjects that are really tangential to this idea of Masonry as an act. The things like history, jurisprudence, famous Masons, you name it, those kind of things, those are tangential to Masonry. And there's a difference between Masonic practice and scholarly research. And most of us aren't going to be Masonic scholars. We can all be scholars in our own right in the fields that we work in. That's acceptable. But the people who I would regard are Masonic scholars, there's a handful of them in the whole world. And those are people that are employed to do that level of research. Most of us are hobbyists doing this stuff. And so I think we need to stop making that the goal. And I'm saying this as a place of respect towards the people I would say are actual scholars, the Art de Hoyos of the world, and the handful of professors that are doing historical research in the area of Masonry. Those people are Masonic scholars, but we don't really need to do that. That's not what we're here to do. If you like that, also, you can be a hobbyist, but let's at least acknowledge that it's a hobby and something you like doing, and it's a little bit different from Masonry. I think Alex and I were talking about this at dinner last night when we said, people listen to history and they go, oh, this is great Masonic education. But it was like, well, it's not really Masonic education. It was just history. And so let's see if I do have these slides in order here. Education is a thing, but not the thing. Masonry is a journey. I think we need to separate Masonry and education. Masonry is the process of developing oneself, making good men better. And education is about listening to interesting anecdotes about Masonry. Okay, so how do we do this? The goal needs to be, I believe, that we rebalance the parts of man which have been suppressed by this obsession to grow the intellectual. And I think that comes from as somewhat speaking from experience, this comes from a place of insecurity. You develop all the knowledge you can so that when someone tries to snap back and say, well, that's not true, that you've got an answer. You've done enough reading that you can always come back with that. This is, and I've listened to psychologists and sociologists talk about this, that when you overdevelop that, it's because you're insecure about maybe not knowing. But the trade-off of growing and obsessing over the intellectual has been spiritual growth and emotional growth. And let me tell you, we got a lot of men in this world and a lot of men in this fraternity who are poorly developed in the emotional side. And I got to ask, like, when did the other stuff become more important, and why is it so difficult for us to express our feelings and explore our feelings? I guess I don't really even care about expressing them, but I think you should at least be comfortable and in touch with your emotions. When do we stop really trying to grow in our faith, expanding our understanding of the natural world? When do we stop exploring the symbols of Masonry? And I don't mean talking, I don't mean lecturing about them. I mean truly reflecting and understanding what those symbols are meant to teach. So what does this look like? I don't know. I know what it looks like for me. I actually have a sense of what it might look for RJ and some other folks who I'm close with, because we've talked about the process of doing these things. And some of those things might be meditation, contemplation on the tools, putting Masonic teaching into practice through selfless acts, which is a lot more than just donating cash, going out, feeding the hungry, listening to people that need to be listened to, prayer, scripture reading. And to really start to explore and to develop your understanding of Masonry as an act, yes, it requires mastery, prerequisite mastery of certain concepts. You do have to understand the broader philosophy of what Masonry is teaching. So that's where you can't totally kick out the intellectual. Alice Bailey talks about this, that you need to master the plane of knowledge before you can approach the plane of the spiritual plane. That's what we're talking about. So this might, and this is going to be a little repetitive, but this might require reading the ritual that you have, looking things up that you don't understand, discussing it, separate out distractions, Okay, we're still kind of dancing around what I'm talking about. And this is usually where this goes when I'm having these conversations. People say, well, but for real, like, what do I got to do? Just give me the steps. And quite honestly, as I reviewed what I'm about to present to you or what I'm about to share, the first folks looked at it and said, you shouldn't be sharing this. Because this is the thing that you're supposed to spend time working and chipping away at before you figure out, okay, this is the template. But I think it's necessary, and I'm not going to give away too much. I think it's necessary for people to hear this. One template, and there are many, but one template involves reading, meditating, praying, contemplating. And we can apply this to Masonic ritual. Select a piece of ritual and you read it. And if you don't fully understand it or you want a little bit deeper, you want to peel back the onion a little bit, yeah, sure. Go to other sources. You got encyclopedias, you got a couple other documents, but only go so far as you need to master the fundamentals of that concept. Stop there because you're all smart enough. We've already covered this. And if you continue to read and you have to look at every other author's version of what the gavel means or what the square and compasses can be, if you have to dig into that, now you're defaulting to another's definition instead of doing the work on your own to developing your own personal meaning of that symbol. Taking that symbol and applying it within your life. You've applied it to a life of, in some cases, people who lived 100 years ago. And it's very different from now. So once you've read that piece, meditate on that piece. Now, I'm not a meditation expert. If you're going to ask me to go through and tell you how to do this, that's tough for me. Center your thoughts, focus on your breathing. And then there are any number of meditative practices. You can find them on YouTube. You can, I would happily connect you with some sources. We've all done the ones where we focus on relaxing every muscle in our body and we step through each portion of our body to help relax us. And then once we're there, once we're truly focused and we're centered in that meditative space, pray. Ask for the assistance of deity. Maybe you're asking for understanding of that symbol. Maybe you're looking for how you can apply this in your life. Whatever is important to you at that time. But we're Masons. When did it become taboo for us to talk about asking the grand architect for help? And so while you're in kind of this meditative prayer space and you're thinking about this piece of ritual, maybe you're envisioning, you're going through a visual exercise of when that lecture was given or when that particular thing happened in one of the degrees. This is where you're looking for that guidance from deity. Once you're through this process, you come back, reground yourself on the earthly plane, and then we can do a contemplative exercise, which might mean rewriting down what you just experienced in your meditation. It might mean listing out the ways that this could strengthen your connection to the world. It might mean drawing the images out that you experienced within your meditation. And that's the process. To me, it's that simple. This is something that each of you in here or online, you all have the ability to master this process. You're capable of doing these things. You don't need new books. You don't need new podcasts. You don't need a master's degree in history. You just need commitment. And unfortunately, most of the Masons that I interact with are not committed to doing this personal work. But I think that being, I believe that you can do this. I believe that you have the capability. It doesn't require buying more stuff. And this is just one template. There are others. This template's not, I didn't even invent this template. I meant to say that earlier. I didn't create this. This template's been around for a long time, has a name. You can Google it. There are other templates out there. And I would also add that if you feel like you can't do this on your own, I just ran through this in 5 or so minutes. The Masonic Legacy Society is a great organization. It's free. You can go on. They will provide a guide. A number of the facilitators are here that will take you through that. They also have dank memes, might be made by the same guy who created the memes you're seeing today. But if you feel like you want to look for something else, Masonic Legacy Society, I believe, can provide that. So I'm going to wrap it up here and just bring us back to the main thesis here, and that is that Masonry is the act of self-improvement. It's not the other stuff. The other stuff's great. And I'm not saying, we use the football analogy, I'm not saying you can't be a huge football fan. Lord knows I'm missing God's team, Notre Dame Fighting Irish, play right now. But don't mistake being a fan with being a player. Don't mistake being, Masonry from Masonic education. Because at the end of the day, what I want from more Masons is for more of you to be players as well as fans instead of just fans. Oh, that's the cool MLS symbol. And that's all I got for you guys. Hopefully. I'm open to questions, conversations, debate. This was a shorter presentation, even without the espresso. This would have been a shorter presentation. And like I said, I was hoping that we would spark some conversation and discussion here.
So we're starting to get some questions that are coming through the Q&A. Mr. Victor Gonzalez, just try to repeat the question for everybody's on. He says, are we making it too easy to become a Mason without acting on what the lessons learned from each degree?
Yeah, I mean, on a widespread scale, the world of Masonry is so massive. But I will say that in my lodge I don't think we invented this, but in my lodge, one of the practices we have is writing a paper in between your degrees. That part I didn't invent. I know a lot of other people do this. It's done all over the world. But the focus of our papers is not a detail in the degree, but the focus is how you applied the degree or how you applied that detail in your life. And to me, that is what you need before you're quote unquote proficient, right? That understanding or that acknowledgement that Masonry isn't just this walk around the room a couple times and say a couple of fancy words. Masonry has this action that you're supposed to be taking these lessons and doing something within their life. And so I think there's opportunities to address that questions directly.
So waiting on questions here. So if you have any questions in the audience, please raise your hand.
Yes.
So you mentioned as part of the initial part of the presentation that a lot of the research and stuff like that is ancillary, which I don't necessarily disagree with, but I wonder what you think about the lack of systems. And this is not about what I do, it's just maybe the frame of reference I come from, but it seems like, if you've got maybe 10 people doing the same research, part of that is because we don't really have much out there to share, or there's not much to build on, or that sort of thing. How much does that play into it, and where does that fit in your model?
Yeah, I think that's a big problem because, and that's where I make this distinction, having lived in the academic world for a while. Like, academic is this system. You have these research. Your school pays for access to share all the research, so you know what people are working on, what they're not working on, or you have some sense. Here, we've got people all spread out, all talking about different things, and all developing in different directions, and it is a big problem. I've seen, I think to your point, I've seen people develop in one direction, kind of a theory or a position on a particular topic, and I've brought that position up with other folks, and people go, I don't think that's accurate. And it's really fascinating. And I'll tell you, like, these two people are people highly respected within the world of Masonry right now. This is an ultra relevant, which is why I'm not naming the people out loud. They're people many of you would know. And so but we aren't getting in the same room. And there's kind of this barrier between, the academic side of Masonic research and Masonicon. And maybe that's where Masons are really essential, because they allow us to start having more of these swirling conversations in different parts of the country, and we're involving people who are, by and large, not the academics. And the stuff we're talking about is arguably less academic. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Next question is from Brother David Allen. He said, "Life is long. Crisis of faith happens. Family and everything else changes. Wouldn't we expect that a brother's commitment to Masonry, self-improvement, and most other things to ebb and flow over the years?"
I think absolutely. I think that's a fair statement. There's a lot of things going on. I think, though, the one area where I would expand on that is, I'd say that once you begin a contemplative practice, it's been my experience, and maybe some of you guys, I'm kind of jumping around the room, but some of you guys might agree, but it's hard to shut off that contemplation. Like, once you've started this, there's constant thought of right and wrong, constant thought of what Masonry teaches and what these symbols teach. And so I would say that, yes, your connection to things kind of ebb and flow, but I think especially in the most difficult times, in the most trying times, you're going to find that you're going to rely, at least in my case, that this is, I shouldn't say for everyone, but for me, I rely more heavily on that contemplative practice than.
Would you say that once you've had that kind of experience, you can't really unring the bell?
Yep, exactly. Yeah, we had one back here.
We run the risk of. So I'm going to preface this by saying I am fully aligned with the idea that every Mason should do the contemplative work. When we talk about the academic side of Masonic research, do we run the risk of what I'll call the religious dogma of, like, there are, you can get into debates with people who go, I'm an Episcopal Christian, I'm a Presbyterian, I'm a Baptist, I'm a whatever, fill in the blank, I don't care, around their interpretation of the Bible, for example, right?
Yeah.
And
people start to go, this person's right, this person's not right. Whereas, is there a point of view that says, just like politics, there is no right or wrong in politics, it's all opinion. So how do you avoid that, I'll say, the conflict side of that?
Yeah.
Bob from the Masonic Society of fill in the blank did a research of this and came to the conclusion that does it matter, or is that just informative in everybody's path up the mountain and there's 1,000 ways to go up type of concept?
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant question, and I want to repeat just so everyone online can hear, and also rephrase to make sure I understand. But so we're asking about kind of, are we worried that there's, or how do we feel about that conflict between really, really dogmatic folks and this idea that we should be coming together? Is that a fair? Yeah, I mean, I think the path to this coming together, I mean, it's something that Masonry should be teaching us, is that we're all one human race. I'm gonna keep the boundaries there. I could take that a little bit further of my own personal position, but I would say that the Masonic boundary is probably right about there, that we're all one human race, and that Masonry should be teaching this. I think that a contemplative practice will only yield that end, or I think it will drive towards that. Maybe I'd love to hear if someone, we could chat about this, but yeah, I think that it works towards that. I will tell you, like, I'm not shy about talking about my own religion. I belong to the Lutheran Church, and that's what I do. People who know me well, that's part of who I am. But also, I recognize that my practice, religiously, dogmatically, that's what works for me. And this is an important, I think, element or lesson that Masonry should be communicating, that what works for me isn't necessarily, or doesn't have to be, the same thing that works for Tim or that works for Dago or anybody else in the room, but that we can all learn from each other based on these different experiences.
Scott, we have a couple more online. Please, Tim.
So, couldn't figure out phrases exactly, but are you implying, and I don't know the words in the mouth, but I think it's a fair assessment that contemplative practice is the bridge between speculative Mason life and the operative Mason life. That's part of what we have going on is our two main force, our speculative Masonry, speculating on everything. They're not really applying it, which is the operative life. And so that contemplative practice is that's really the bridge to help get people there to that operative.
Yeah, I think so. I hadn't thought about it like that, but I like the way you described that. Yeah, Brother Dustin?
Are you suggesting that this would be a good program for educators and lodges to enter into? For example, people who might have a bit of a marathon building themselves. So that education, I want you guys to relax and think about square today, visualize the square. What's that square mean? Think about walk around on square. Then, let's say 5 minutes, circle, your thoughts.
So I'm hesitant to answer that as the great education officer. What I will say is you're describing something that's very much in line with Masonic Legacy Society and what they teach. But something else I've always said is every lodge is different, and you got to be real cautious how hard you're pushing a lodge in one direction or another. And some things just aren't right for every lodge. I think that's what needs to what Masons should be doing. But this is my own opinion, my own perspective. So it's really tough for me to say. And I think it's reckless for me to say, go into every lodge and do this. Did you have more on there?
Yeah. We have Brother Daniel Valdez says, when reflecting on the lessons in a degree, what if your interpretation differs from your mentor?
Oh, I love that. Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up. I think discussion is one of the important elements, and one of the beauties of Masonry that often gets overlooked is we know there are other orders that you can join that end up being very solitary experiences. But in Masonry, it's a fraternity. You're surrounded by guys who are learning the same lessons and engaged in the same, united by the same ritual. You should be discussing it. And I think one of the things that I'm always cautious, and I usually make this statement when I'm talking about things along this lines, is like, you can come up with your own interpretation, and a lot of times it's probably pretty well founded. But I have come across some people that I'm like, I think you're way off the mark there, and we need it. And I'm glad we're talking about it. So I think like that discussion is really what helps create some guardrails. And I've been way off the mark before. As I look back, there are things that I thought I understood that I really didn't, and I needed to explore them more. And so that's the beauty of Freemasonry. We should be discussing those things and understanding where we might have missed the mark.
Tolerance is one of the first things that we learn, and also the best can work with the best degree. So that kind of pulls people together along some of their lines.
Yeah.
Practical application of mysteries and all different aspects of the teach is something that I agree is not an equal part besides just what is presented in the rituals. Yes, it's there. Into aspects of those individual
Mm-hmm.
how are you understand? But I would say it comes full circle as find those that come together with us and you learn from each of this beauty of history from all of it, all around all the traditions, the similarities to unify humanity. I agree. It's a lot of fun separated, but I think like certain small things on Dale comes back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I wouldn't disagree with that. Did you have something, Joe? Sure.
And my name is Robert Johnson. So I hold back to your question and Scott response and what you said. I think once someone really becomes implementation, then I think a lot of the dogma that we were talking about might fall by the wayside. I can look in this room and I can have those deep contemplative conversations with people in this room, and I know that I'm going to have an honest discourse, not argument or my logic. I think those things kind of fall away if you're really being a contemplative person. Now, guessing all of it, and I think what I thought was the surface, and that's all you've got. But I think that's one of the biggest problems in this fraternity is that when I first came to this fraternity, I've been basic for 15 years, but I never tell people that because I always tell people I consider myself born again. The first 7 or 8 years was reading in March. there, what the purpose was, and what they did in the first thing. So those guys were like saying that, but I always tell people that I'm actually myself for anything. It wasn't until I had through where I started to internalize and actually look at the practices and spend time and meditate on it and pray on it and then contemplate on it. And I think that's unfortunately hard. Back to your point. Yeah, us like-minded individuals, we can interact with people, but sadly, with my heart, I'm worried. I think that's probably one of the biggest issues that faces the craft as a whole. Brother Johnson, thank you.
So we've got another question from Brother David Allen. He says, you mentioned that men have a hard time discussing their feelings. In my experience, that's true, probably mostly cultural. Isn't this by itself a direct blocker to help one another with more meaningful paths? Do you think it's better to try to jump into the deep end of the pool or work on lodge culture and these other types of things to create an environment where these discussions can happen?
David, I started a new lodge. So that should probably tell you what I think. Like, I think it's really tough to work on lodge culture. I think because we've created this machismo world of Masonry, then we built this whole thing up and we've created such a wall that breaking through that and adjusting it, in some lodges, at least in my experience, wasn't really possible. So, I worked with RJ and some of my closest friends to start a new lodge where we could influence the culture a little bit more. But yeah, I think that's an important question. I think, something everyone should be doing is looking at their lodge and kind of exploring what capability exists for those paths. There's probably not one answer for every lodge. Jeremy, how are we doing on time?
You have 12 more minutes.
Oh.
So just to jump in for a second, because I think there's a couple of things that have been touched on that, I'll be the bad guy to RJ's bad guy. I've got to say I fundamentally disagree with the idea that it's sad that we're the minority, right? And I think it came up a little bit in the other question, on discussing their feelings and ethnic culture and whatever it may be. What came in my head, when you said was, well, a lot of being able to discuss things with other people is being comfortable with yourself, which also jumped out with the feelings piece. I have a quote that I like that roughly translated from French says, you don't need to understand something in order to argue about it. And that's usually where I come from. But I think as we get to be better men and better humans, right, we don't have to take things so personally. And therefore, we can have these debates, and I can yell across the room and go, I think you're wrong. And there's nothing wrong with that, because it's not disrespectful. But I also want to point out that we don't have to be the minority. Part of it is us being so comfortable with ourselves, and in a respectful way, don't get me wrong, that we enforce this becoming the majority, right? Because I'll make the case, and you would probably, I don't know, don't put words in your mouth, probably agree, having started a new lodge, saying, you know what, I don't want people that don't at least reasonably get this to be in this circle. Mm-hmm. And I know this discussion is fraught with drama, because some people could take it as saying, oh, all these Masons shouldn't be Masons, and that's not really where I'm trying to go. But I think if we can do a lot more ourselves to say, this is what's important to me about Freemasonry, this is what I want to convey to other people, and how can we help them do more research or whatever it is to get to the point where they in their own walks are comfortable enough with themselves that they can have a reasonable conversation with anybody in them. right?
Yeah.
You don't have to agree with me, but if all you're doing is spouting stuff, well, there's where you gotta grow. And how can we put the effort in with those people and get them to blossom and become born again?
Yeah, the one thing that comes to mind as you point that out is the adage that hopefully I can make somebody uncomfortable. All politics is local. And if you understand what that means, that like political movements on a national scale, at least in this country, they arise out of local and regional problems, things that people can actually connect with. And so if you think about that, think about Masonry through that lens, you start to understand that that my goal or my interest is in changing a couple minds or just providing the outlet for a couple of minds that are in my circle. And hopefully those people can move out and network out from there. But I can't expect, it's really, really tough to expect to change people on a large jurisdictional or national level scale. And so when we talk about making widespread change, I almost think that's next to impossible. But focus on making a difference where you can.
We have a question that kind of ties into that, Brother Marty. He says, great presentation. He really needed to hear this. Do you have any practical advice for guiding masters and wardens in moving their lodge members in this direction? Do you think it's better being done on a one-to-one basis, or what?
Yeah, it's sort of tough to think about that because I don't know. I mean, Marty, you and I know each other, so but so I kind of know where you're coming from, but I don't know personally the dynamics within your lodge. But I think, in some lodges, this is something that can happen in a small group. And some lodges, this is something you could just test out one night in lodge. And in other lodges, it's going to be pushing so hard against people that are not interested in it, that it's going to do more harm than good. So I think you have to figure out how you navigate those waters, and you guys know your lodges best. I keep seeing one pop up here.
Yeah, I think the question a dialogue in this conversation we're getting is tremendous. And for what Brother Jeremy was just talking about in terms of, I think back to my religious upbringing, and I went to church every Sunday as a kid. Given that, I think a lot of brothers, in my opinion, treat Masonry in the same way as I treated going to church as a kid, which is, I went, great, I sat there, they got up, they talked, and then I, went home and had Sunday dinner, and maybe I got something out of it, maybe I didn't. And I think for a lot of brothers, in some ways, Masonry is similar in that they go to lodge because they, whatever they go to lodge, and they listen, and sometimes somebody talks about a topic like this. But I think if it's like church, if it's just being talked to from the pulpit, you may or may not take away whatever the pastor or priest or whoever intended you to take away. If it's a dialogue, to your point, now I'm engaged, now I'm thinking about it, now I'm talking about it, now I'm participating in it. And I think the more that we can make that the way that you get that out there to the brothers, the more impactful it is, the more opportunity there is to have it not be the minority, have it not be the, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, and to that point, excellent. I'm glad I paid you to set up this promo here. But in April, Chicagoland will be hosting the Midwest Conference on Masonic Education, and that is a big focus of what we're trying to address is how we teach our educators, how we give them the skills to foster dialogue. That still focuses on Masonry. I'm not trying to create a church men's group out of this, but But to your point, like in the church realm, like sometimes that's the best learning, the best opportunity for growth. In masonry, like it still has to focus on masonry, but on the ritual and the philosophy. But yeah, I think having a dialogue, and then you no longer have to be that expert. You don't have to be an expert on a topic. You can facilitate growth and learning without that particular expertise. And so, yeah, April, come back. Yeah, right here.
Okay. First, like I said, everything logical 165. I want to say great presentation.
Thank you.
Second part, I'll say my name is Robert Johnson, Secretary of Space Global Class. And I'd like for you to listen to this and then give me your feedback on which is, Masonic education is not masonry, but masonry without Masonic education is the shrine, or the Elks. I mean, it's one of those things. We talked about them becoming very, what you're saying is we can come to myopic. And
yeah.
Concentrating on the spiritualists of the 19th centuries and the Manly Halls and doing that. But teaching people how to relate feelings, creating the atmosphere where men can share, doing all these things is part of the education program. And that should not be forgotten.
Totally agree. Yeah. Yeah. What I'm trying to do is bracket around what we're calling Masonic education and say, let's do a little bit less of that and just rebalance it to some other stuff. So I'm going to, I think there's still quite a few questions. I'm going to call it time to break here. And then, we've got time the rest of the day. We can continue these conversations, dinner, But I do want to thank you guys for your time. This has been a wonderful experience for me.
You did it.
I did.
All right, so thank you guys so much for hanging out for brother Scott Dueball here. We've got about a 10-minute break, so feel free to bombard him and give him claustrophobic with questions and everything else. Everybody online, loud and clear. I know you can't hear a lot of the audience questions, so we'll try to speak up, and in the break I will try to find some sort of a way to mic people asking questions afterwards. So stay tuned, and we'll be back in 10 minutes.